Thank you. So this is where we have some audience participation, I think. So I'm not an expert in microbiome. I've been in drug discovery for 25 years, so I'm an expert. Well, I know drug discovery, and I also know IMI. So I look after IMI's portfolio for GSK. So I'm blissfully ignorant of the facts regarding microbiome, but I'm assuming that you guys in the audience will be able to help me. But when I was contemplating giving this presentation last night to a group of microbiome experts, I thought I'd better get some information in my head. So I went onto Google and I typed microbiome, and I got 5 million hits in half a second. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to read all of those, but that tells me one thing, that there's a huge amount of activity going on in microbiome across the industry. So then I thought, okay, so how many therapies are there in microbiome? So I typed in microbiome therapeutics, and I got 500,000 hits. So that's quite a big difference. So what did that tell me? It says there's a lot of work going on, but there's not that many therapies coming out of it. And then I typed in licensed therapies, and it went down even more to 100,000. So from a non-microbiome expert, I'm starting to think, okay, so what's going on here? There's a huge amount of work going on. There's a huge amount of opportunity, but we haven't managed to get to the point where we've got licensed therapies on the market. So I thought, okay, so how much money is going into microbiome funding? So I just typed in venture funding. And I have to say, the amount of venture funding, capital funding, the investment from the companies going into microbiome is eye-watering, actually. There's a huge amount of money going in. So what does that tell me? It tells me we've got a huge opportunity to actually bring microbiome therapies to patients. And the other thing I think I looked at by scanning these 5 million hits was that actually microbiome seems to be associated with a whole range of diseases that you wouldn't necessarily think as a non-expert would be associated with the microbiome. So then I put my drug discovery hat on and I thought, okay, so what do we need to do now to turn all of this plethora of information from all these really bright guys doing all of this fantastic work across the world into something that can benefit a patient? And from a drug discovery perspective, you know, you start to think about how we're going to use the information that we're generating. And certainly today, there are a number of things that have bubbled to the surface. First of all, you know, there are a number of approaches we could take to use a microbiome therapy. We can look at wellness, we can look at diet, and actually keeping somebody well in the first place is much better than letting them get sick and then having to treat them. Not only is it an economic burden, but actually just the complexity of diagnosis and treatment. We heard yesterday that actually, scarily, a huge amount of diagnoses are incorrect. So, but actually, microbiome, again, it can be used as a diagnosis for disease. And I think that starts to interest pharma, because we can use something tangible to treat somebody. So then you think about therapeutic targets, and we've heard a lot about, today, certainly I've learned a lot about treating individuals with live therapies. And actually, as I understand it, the only therapy that's actually being used successfully in the clinic is a fecal transplant for C. diff and IBD. So, but actually, you know, from a pharma industry perspective, whilst, you know, we are starting to open the door on cell therapies, live therapies, actually we do a lot in small molecules as well. So what small molecules could we put in place that would actually affect a microbiome treatment? And then you start to think about, you know, the interaction between the host, the microbiome, and the metabolites of the bugs that are actually causing probably some of these effects. So actually, my head hurts right now in terms of the stuff that I've learned over the past couple of days, but it does represent a huge opportunity. Sorry, how do I move the slides forward, the green thing?
Yes, I think we have a problem with the presentation, and yes, apparently it was not uploaded. They are trying to solve it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That's tricky. So effectively,
so
you know.
If you want, I'll have a bigger copy.
No, that's no problem. So like I say, I'm not the microbiome expert, but I do know that, you know, there are members in the audience that have been involved in the team that have pulled together this as a proposal for an IMI project. And what we're looking for right now, what the team is looking for, is your feedback on you know, how interested would you be in a project that we're just about to present, and what's missing, what could you bring, what would excite you about the project that's being proposed right now. It's a bit difficult to actually talk without the slides.
The presentation is sick.
No.
Yeah, she's trying to find it out. Yeah. Just going in deep in the presentation. Thanks.
No problem. So the upside is you've just had a coffee, so you're mentally stimulated and ready to participate in this discussion, right? So there we go. So these guys are the guys that have developed this proposal. And I think the point, one of my long ramble at the introduction, my point is that these guys represent pharma and the nutrition industry. So there's a potential to look at both wellness and diet, but also to treat disease, which is where the big pharma's expertise will come into play. And, I can't say I'm representing Jim Brown, who's put this together on the behalf of the team. So, again, I have the pleasure of presenting last in the day, which means most of my slides have already been presented. so I'm not actually going to go through this slide in any detail, or the next one actually. But I think, again, it's something else that I've learned from just my brief foray into microbiome is that we've got a chicken and egg situation quite a lot of the time. We don't know what's causing the effect. We don't know if it's disease affecting the microbiome or the microbiome affecting the disease. There's probably instances where both is the case, right? So again, what we're trying to do is, with the project that we're discussing, is actually to try and understand longitudinal disease pathways a little bit better and try and understand mechanism. And I think the last point on this slide is the important one for me, and I guess the regulators will also be important to the regulators as well, that actually we can put things in place, we can probably affect the microbiome, but actually, is what we're suggesting better or not that's already there? And I think for us in pharma, in terms of producing a therapy to benefit a patient, there has to be a very clear benefit ratio in terms of us giving that molecule. So I think that's one of the key things I'd like you to think about as we go forward. And again, this slide's already been presented as well, but effectively we have a huge number of diseases that have been attributed to microbiome, even though we don't necessarily understand all of the pathways. We've got hints and tips that the microbiome is important, but again, you've got this chicken and egg situation going on. So what Jim and the team have realised is that actually what we need is some well-designed clinical studies to try and understand what's happening in people, and then try and relate those clinical studies back to the majority of the work that seems to have been done in cross-sectional human studies or preclinically, to try and be able to translate some kind of reading and enable us to actually develop therapies against specific disease targets. So what they have suggested, and there is a document that follows this. If people would like it, then please either contact me or Jim and we can forward it to you. It's a very draft document. But they've put together effectively some brief deliverables and brief outline of a project. And effectively, the key deliverable here is the robust testing of mechanistic hypotheses regarding microbiome's role in health and disease. And I think, going back to my introduction, is that there is so much we could do, and there is so much that is being done. Let's build a project that actually really focuses down and moves the needle and tries to deliver something for patients. And how do we do that? And I haven't got the answer to that. That's why we're presenting in the room, and that's what the team will want to do. But what they're suggesting is a raft of human clinical trials, exploratory medicine, to actually understand longitudinal disease progression, in combination with all the things that have already been discussed today. So omics, data sets, computational models. So it needs to be a fully integrated package. We can't just have samples from a clinical trial that's already been done necessarily without that whole package of omics and activities and disease understanding that goes along with it. So it sounds to me like it's a new clinical trial. That's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at samples from previous clinical trials, but actually it's longitudinal is what we need. And I think one of the things that Jim's looking for is actually to use these studies to not necessarily test, but test hypothesis around microbiome modulators, either in vivo or ex vivo, as the slide says. So what would those things be? Would they be small molecules, prebiotics, probiotics? And you guys will have a much better understanding of the things that are probably going to be most impactful in these sort of studies. So again, the floor is open. So what Jim and the team are looking at certainly are different sorts of longitudinal studies. And again, I think these are up for discussion. I think for me, I can get my head around the first bullet, which is a longitudinal study of microbiome in disease. Certainly, the FBA companies that will be associated with IMI will all have disease areas that they can supply clinical samples from, and disease understanding will be available in those companies. So I can see that the FBA companies would certainly want to drive these disease studies. But actually, there are other sectors, the food sectors, that would be looking just at longitudinal studies of lifestyle changes, and again, they're on the slides, or specific interventions around nutritional supplements, prebiotics, probiotics, vaccines, etc. So I guess, the floor is open. For me, it would be easy for me to say, let's focus on disease, but that wouldn't cover the whole gambit of the people in the room and what they're expecting to do. However, what we are suggesting is to put things in place with a very focused and clear purpose to prove or disprove hypotheses around microbiome in human health. So it needs to be a focused activity. So, again, what industry is good at is drug development, understanding a target, bringing a molecule to target, or bringing a therapy, I should say, to target, and getting that onto the market. What the public institutions have, and that's been displayed today quite a lot actually, which is why I have got a headache, is a deep and broad understanding of what the microbiome is, and the specific mechanistic understanding of how the microbiome is interacting with not only the immune system but directly with the intestine. Access to bacterial strains, etc. So effectively, the floor is open. So it is a suggestion for an IMI project to be launched sometime in the future. It's looking like longitudinal clinical studies to understand specific facets of how the microbiome affects health and how we can deal with that. So I'll leave it there. I think that's the last slide. But thoughts, suggestions, questions? Is that completely off the wall?
Thank you, Graham. So any question in the room?
So what therapies, what disease areas are going to be most impactful for a clinical study moving forward? From the room. Any thoughts?
So thank you, Vijay.
So my bias in this is chasing diseases that are HLA driven, so we know who the people are at risk.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
No, so my bias is on diseases that are HLA driven. So for example, type 1 diabetes and celiac disease are two great examples. So we could have studies in Italy where there is a rising incidence of celiac disease. We could start collecting longitudinal microbiome before the anti-TTG antibody goes up, and then so those would be a great example of how this could be done through a public-private partnership.
Great, thank you. Any others? So what about microbiome modulation? So, effectively, there are fecal transplants on the market. What do you feel as a group would be a sensible raft of microbiome modulators to be looking at? Any thoughts on that?
So another question there.
I think it has to be contextual, the type of modality that you would pursue. I think in many chronic diseases which are multifactorial but a very complex phenotype, you can argue whether a highly targeted approach is effective enough. Again, it depends. There are examples pro and examples con. I think with the microbiome, and now zooming in on microbial products, either single strain or multi-strain consortia, I think we have the opportunity to benefit of the polypharmacology that can be achieved, either through direct or indirect effects. I think that would certainly warrant further investigation on what the value is of that type of intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. So you has a question?
Regarding the disease areas, with the discussions that you've had with the other companies, do you foresee that you would select one disease area that you agree on, or are you going to do a parallel approach, maybe trying different disease areas but then combining the placebo arms, and then you can have your proprietary work and then have your publicly available, publicly accessible sort of baseline coming from the placebo arms? I don't know, but I was just wondering what discussions have already taken place on that.
So I think all things are possible, aren't they? But I think it's very easy to suggest placebo arms from clinical trials, but they need to be in context, and the studies need to be well designed to be able to provide meaningful information. I think my own view is that, you know, we run the risk in a disease area or an area that we don't understand of just stamp collecting information without having enough context to make it meaningful. And I think whatever we choose to do, it has to be very tight, very well designed, and very focused to be able to, you know, get a proper understanding out the other end. So, you know, I think it will depend on the number of companies that want to contribute and, you know, where they have an expertise. I mean, you know, GSK, for example, we might want to look at respiratory exacerbations with microbiome, bacterial metabolites on, you know, the lung. So we may have a completely different focus to you know, some of you guys that are IBD or celiac disease focused. So I think it's, you know, it's going to be dictated to a certain extent by where the pharmaceutical company has its expertise and where it sees a gap, actually.
And in terms of the your question regarding modulation of the microbiome, do you, or have, obviously the team have discussed this, but do you think we're really in a position to be able to move to modulating the microbiome at this stage?
I think the answer could be yes, but I think it depends what we choose to modulate the microbiome with. So I think from brief discussions I had with Jim, effectively, if there are things that are grass generally regarded as safe that we could use, then potentially. But I think there needs to be a reason, which is why I, you know, kind of put it out there in terms of what would people do, what would people use. Because I think it's probably highly dependent on the disease, and the microbiome depending on the disease as to the microbiome modulator you would use. So again, that's what kind of makes my head hurt a little bit in terms of what do you do here? But whatever you do needs to be focused towards a specific therapy.
So any other things that you would like to ask to Graham? No? So I think we can... yeah, Dusko?
Have to keep earning my money. Yeah, so I think it's great to, you know, this direction towards longitudinal studies, because so few of them are around, and we certainly need more. Now, what kind of time frame could be covered? You know, IMI can't cover 20 years, you know, so it's, and perhaps that should then be a factor in choosing a focus. You know, in what type of disease would you expect sufficient number of changes during that period of time, which then could be correlated perhaps or not with microbiome changes or composition at the beginning of whatever you want to look at. You know, we thought like liver cirrhosis can we detect you know, incidents, events, but you need large cohorts, and there are not that many events because people are taken care of, you know, and that really is well beyond my area of expertise. I'm a lowly microbiologist, but you know, that's something that should be integrated into the trial if it's to be informative.
No, that's a great point, actually. And the reason I say it's a great point is so I helped to lead the Immunology SGG, which is the Strategic Governance Group in Immunology. And we discussed putting a trial in place to understand remission in IBD. But the reality is, most projects are 5 years. How many events would you have that you'll be able to measure? And as a result, we ended up not doing anything for that very reason. So that's a really great point, actually. Yeah, well made.